Hi everyone, it's me, Dr. Kate. I'm back for our week 4 of our 6-week summer session course on sexuality and queer theory. And a couple things I want to talk about today are first some notes on last week's readings and discussion boards, and then just some introductory remarks for the book you can tell just by looking that you'll be working with this week. So last week discussion boards were great. Y'all really understood well the arguments presented by both texts. Halberstam's text, as a number of you pointed out in the discussion board, is a little dated. It assumes that reproductive time is something that only heterosexual people have access to, and that heterosexual people still have access to it. So as a number of you pointed out, the ideas around reproductive time that one can say afford to buy a house and have children and those kinds of things are becoming less and less true. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes the way that we think about living collectively. So that was a really good point brought up by a number of you. In terms of realness, you all understood that really well as well. Marlon Bailey makes it really clear in his essay that realness is both a matter of survival, which you all understood quite well, but it's also, and this comes through I think most in the film, Paris is Burning, realness is also about being yourself. So it's not like it's a costume that's put on necessarily, right? So it's also a way of being seen as the person you are in a society that doesn't necessarily want to see you that way. So realness is a way of, it's sort of part of how identity works, right? This way that we might know who we are, and we present ourselves as that in the world, but we don't necessarily have control over whether or not the world sees us that way. So when I asked the question, does the reading help you think about identity differently for everybody? One of the things that I wanted to sort of draw out from that question was the idea that realness isn't something that only affects people in ballroom cultures, right? All of us are, in a way, sort of presenting ourselves and hoping that we're seen as real, right? So this idea of realness is fundamental to identity itself, but the stakes of it are really, really different. Kyler made this point in his post, are really, really different for a lot of us, right? That realness is about basic survival. So those were just a couple of points from last week's readings that I wanted to bring up. Now, looking ahead to this week's work, you have a discussion board due on August 2nd, and then you have your next exam due shortly after that. So be sure to, we're sort of crunching together some writing assignments as we get through this course. So take a look at your calendar and make sure that you've saved yourself enough time to complete the writing assignments. So you can tell just by looking. This is a book that deconstructs different myths about gay life, and it is, I think, deceptively easy to read. And by that I mean there are a lot of really sort of abstract and intense concepts that are presented in this book, but it's done in a way that's really uses examples to really help us understand it. And so it should be a little bit easier to read than, say, Halberstam's essay, which had a lot of abstract language in it. So I hope that you find the reading of it enjoyable. It's the kind of book that a lot of students end up giving to their parents to read. But I want to say just a couple things about it. The introduction to the book is going to, please do take your time and to read that pretty carefully, because it talks about what myths do. And one of the things I want to point out before you get started is that myths aren't good or bad. That's not what they're interested in. They're not interested in like exploding bad myths and telling the truth about gay life. That's less important to them than understanding how sexuality and myths around sexuality function, like what they teach us about what's the right way to be in the world, or what relationships count and are important, right? So things like that. So on page XII, which I guess that's 12 in Roman numerals, in page XII, they talk about how they don't care about whether myths do good things or bad things. And some of the myths that they deconstruct are ones that a lot of LGBTQ people find very supportive and meaningful and real. So for example, one of the myths they deconstruct is that we were all born this way. And that's a sentiment that rings true for a lot of people, right? I feel like I'm born this way. I can't remember being anything else. It becomes an anthem, right? When Baby I Was Born This Way is the song of the summer. But the writers of this book are going to say that that myth it's a myth, and it functions to sort of freeze sexuality in a way that isn't quite accurate. So you'll definitely see some echoes of our reading and thinking about history in this. So keep that in mind, and remember that there's no sexuality outside of a world that gives sexuality meaning and purpose. And they make this point in the introduction. So they're interested in how myths around sexuality, how they teach us about ourselves and our social world and our expectations. The next point I wanted to make is to just go quickly through the myths, the work that myths do. And this is a question on your exam as well. And this is in the introduction. But myths do a few basic things. One, they uphold existing social rules and expectations. Number two, they erase complications and difference in everyday life. And that's absolutely true. You'll see that in all of the myths. They make uncomfortable questions somebody else's problem. Fourth, they keep secrets. They hide different kinds of truths. And five, myths inhibit logical discussion. So when you're reading the myths, think about what of those things that myths do the particular myth is doing. So for example, the first myth, the sort of title myth, you can tell just by looking, assumes that the myth is that you can tell somebody's gay by looking at them. Now, this is a myth that you may have heard of gaydar, right? The ability to tell if somebody's gay, and that's what this myth is talking about. And when you read how they undo it, it's actually pretty subtle, right? Because a lot of us can tell by looking, right? If you are queer, you might be familiar with that experience of seeing somebody in a new town or at a restaurant or on the bus, and there's like a knowing nod or a look. And I can't produce it for you right here, but it's like a look and like a sense of like, oh, that's somebody who's like me. So how do we account for those feelings while also understanding that sexuality isn't something that you can tell just by looking at someone? And so they'll talk about, when they undo it, the way that myth upholds existing social rules and expectations of what a person has to look like to be gay or to be straight. It erases complications and differences of everyday life, right? The idea that everyone is either straight or gay, and that desire is, if you're straight, your desire is always focused towards opposite gender attraction and vice versa, right? A lot of the myths, they'll talk about, sort of explode that kind of easy assumption that sexuality is stable. It makes uncomfortable questions somebody else's problem, right? If somebody's, like, how do you tell if somebody's gay or not? Well, gay people can do it with their special gaydar. And they're going to ultimately argue that this myth that you can tell just by looking, what it might be doing is marking the way that desire animates everyday life for everybody, not just for gay people. The way that look, that holding the eyes just a second longer than usual, is part of communicating desire, and not necessarily I want to jump your bones desire, but desire as an you're interesting and I would like to know you, right? That sort of moment. And so that myth of gaydar erases those complications in the way that desire animates the rest of life. So you'll see that coming through a lot of those. When you're picking which myths to read, read through the first paragraph or two and find one that you, I would suggest finding one that you really truly believe, and then see how their undoing of it, if it changes your thought at all. When you're writing on the discussion board and also in the exam, I'm interested in seeing you really unpack what evidence do the authors use to challenge the myth and to make their own arguments. So really focus in on that. So for example, you can tell just by looking, the evidence that they talk about is like scientific studies of what if we just show someone the eyes of a bunch of pictures of people's eyes, and then we ask them to push a button, gay or straight, right? People are better than average at that, right? So it's better than chance that they're getting it right. So that's evidence that you can tell just by looking, right? But they read it a little differently. So pay attention to how they use that evidence to make those arguments. And then I'll just end with this quotation from XVII, also known as 17 in Roman numerals. They write, "Myths help negotiate the messiness of personal and cultural histories that shape how we live and understand our lives. In this way, all myths express some kind of truth." So what they mean by this is that there is the truth of myths lies in how they shape how we live and understand ourselves, not necessarily that they are true, right? So they're true in the context of setting the stage for how we understand ourselves. So I hope this little intro has been helpful. Again, if you have any questions or you want to talk, we could talk on the phone. If you're struggling with any of the readings, just send me an email and I'm more than happy to help. Happy reading this week, and I look forward to reading your work. Bye.